There are days when you don't shatter. You simply fade, quietly, invisibly, like someone dimming the lights inside your chest without asking for permission. And the strange part is this: the world keeps moving, conversations flow, deadlines pile up, and your body still goes through the motions. But something essential, something you used to call you, slips a few steps behind, watching life occur from a distance that feels both protective and unbearably lonely. Most people don't see this kind of disappearance. It's not dramatic. It doesn't scream for help. It's the quiet collapse, the kind that happens without a sound. And maybe that's why it hurts more, because you're still here. But you're not here in the way you used to be. The core pain. There's a specific kind of emotional pain that modern adults carry, a pain so subtle that it often goes unnamed for years. It's not sadness, it's not anxiety. It's something emptier, quieter, more difficult to point at. It's the feeling of being disconnected from your own emotional life. It shows up in small ways. You stop reacting to things that used to move you. You answer texts but don't truly respond. You watch your relationships continue on autopilot. You feel yourself drifting from your hobbies, from your energy, from the people you love. And none of it is chosen. None of it is intentional. You just stop feeling in the ways you expect a human being to feel. But here's the part that most people never admit out loud. It's not that you don't care, it's that you can't reach the part of yourself that does care. There's a gap, thin but impenetrable, between your internal world and the experiences happening around you. A delay, a numb filter, a muffled layer that makes everything feel slightly unreal. This is the core emotional pain the mind tries to hide, the quiet terror of emotional absence. It's waking up and realizing that the spark you used to rely on, your curiosity, your warmth, your sense of aliveness, has retreated somewhere deeper, somewhere unreachable. It's the fear that you might never get it back. And yet, on the outside, you function. You hold conversations. You meet expectations. You play your role in the world because the world insists that you must. But inside, you feel like a person standing behind soundproof glass, knocking, hoping someone, maybe even yourself, will hear you. For some people, this silence arrives after burnout. For others, after heartbreak, chronic stress, years of self-abandonment, or the slow erosion of emotional bandwidth in a life that demands too much and gives too little back. And for many, it arrives without warning. Just a slow dimming, a steady fading, a hollowing out of what used to feel like a rich inner landscape. You become a witness to your own life instead of a participant. Not broken, not empty, but muted. There's a word for this experience, though most people don't use it. Anhedonia, the loss of the ability to feel pleasure, interest, or emotional resonance. But labels alone don't capture the full truth, because the heart of this pain isn't simply not feeling, it's the fear underneath it. What if this numbness is permanent? What if I'm losing myself? What if I'll never reconnect with my own life the way I once did? When emotions fall silent, a part of you does too. And yet, beneath the silence, something else lives there. A faint presence, a quiet survivor. A part of you that hasn't disappeared, just temporarily retreated into the deeper chambers of your nervous system. The goal of this journey is not to fix you. MindRabbit never tries to do that. The goal is to help you understand the deeper mechanism behind your disappearance, why you faded, why your emotions stepped back, and why this silence, painful as it is, might actually be a form of protection rather than loss. Because the truth is simpler and more human than you've been told. You didn't lose yourself. You stepped into a quieter room inside your mind because the outside world became too loud. And in that room, there is still a heartbeat, still a flicker, still a you waiting to return when it becomes safe to feel again. There's a small apartment on the east side of Portland where the light enters slowly, as if it's hesitant to disturb the quiet inside. Picture a single window facing north. The glass is cool, faintly fogged. Morning settles in the room like dust, soft, muted, almost apologetic. On the floor next to a half-open notebook, someone sits with their back against the wall. Not crying, not shaking, not visibly distressed, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from a mind that has powered down to its lowest setting. They hold a ceramic mug between both hands, not drinking, just feeling the temperature, warm enough to remind them their fingers still exist, not warm enough to reach anything deeper. The apartment is quiet, too quiet, no music. No TV humming in the background, just the low rumble of a heater and the occasional car passing outside. These sounds barely graze their awareness. Everything lands softly, like someone threw a blanket over reality. And in that stillness, they look around the room, at the unmade bed, the plant that needs water, the pile of mail they've been avoiding, and something inside them feels distant, like watching the life of a stranger. They know this place. They know this routine. They know every corner of this apartment by heart. But the familiarity feels hollow, as though memory and presence have slipped out of sync. There's a particular moment, one that people rarely talk about, when you realize you're not reacting to your own life anymore. You're observing it, detached, muted, a half step removed from everything that once touched you. The person stands, sets the mug on the counter, and moves toward the window. The city outside looks serene, pedestrians bundled in coats, a cyclist gliding past puddles, a dog tugging at its leash with impatient joy. Normal life, predictable life, life with texture and edges. But from inside the apartment, it all feels distant, like a movie playing on low volume. They rest their forehead against the glass. It's cold, strangely comforting. For a second, the world sharpens. The bite of the window pane, the weight of their breathing, the faint ache in their neck from last night's restless sleep. Then, as quickly as the clarity arrives, it dissolves again. Numbness is rarely a dramatic wave. More often, it's a slow drip. Tiny withdrawals of emotional color until one day everything feels washed in the same shade of gray. They try to remember the last time they felt genuinely moved by a conversation, a song, a moment of joy. The memory exists but faintly, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Colors bleached, details lost. There's no panic, no spiral, just a quiet knowing. Something in me has gone offline. They slide down the wall again, pulling their knees close, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Like their body is trying to make itself smaller, trying to conserve whatever emotional energy remains. Outside, the day continues. Inside, it feels like time doesn't move. Hours pass like a soft blur. Tasks remain untouched. The phone buzzes once, twice, then stops. They don't check it, not because they don't care, but because the effort feels heavier than it should. And maybe you've been in a moment like this, where your body moves. Your mind tracks the hours, but your emotional self feels suspended somewhere behind you. A pause you didn't choose, a slowing you can't explain. A distance that feels both protective and deeply unsettling. There's a detail in this scene that matters more than it seems. The person isn't collapsing. They're not falling apart. They're not even visibly suffering. They're simply existing in a state the nervous system enters when it has been pushed beyond what it can metabolize. It looks like emptiness, but it's something else. A quiet recalibration, a dimming meant to protect the circuitry within. And as the afternoon light begins to fade, the person finally lifts their head. Not with urgency, just a subtle shift, like they're resurfacing for a brief moment before sinking back down. They whisper to themselves, not out of drama, but because they need to hear something in their own voice. I don't feel like myself anymore. Not a confession, not a plea. Just the quiet truth of someone who can sense their emotional life retreating into the deeper rooms of their mind. A truth many people live in silence. A truth that becomes the doorway to understanding what's really happening beneath the numbness, the biology, the psychology, and the strange grace hidden within emotional shutdown. The first thing you need to know is this. When you feel emotionally muted, your brain isn't failing, it's protecting you. But protection doesn't always feel comforting. Sometimes it feels like absence, like a curtain lowering inside your chest. To understand this state, we have to look gently at what the nervous system does when life becomes heavier than the mind can metabolize. Most people think emotional numbness is a psychological problem, a sign of weakness or apathy. But neuroscience tells a different, quieter story. What you're feeling is less like giving up, and more like a forced reboot, a shift into a mode the body uses when it senses it has run out of safe capacity. Let's start with the basics. Your nervous system has two main gears, activation, and shutdown. Activation is the familiar one: stress, urgency, alertness. It's what keeps you functioning even when you don't want to. It's what gets you through a rough work week or a demanding semester. It's what pushes you to answer emails when your body would rather collapse. Many Americans spend years in this state without realizing how much it costs. Shutdown, on the other hand, is quieter, subtle, often invisible. It's the state your body enters when activation has been stretched too far for too long. Think of it like a circuit breaker. When emotional current becomes overwhelming, the system flips off certain internal switches to prevent permanent damage. This is not a choice. It's biology acting on your behalf. Deep inside your brain, the amygdala, the region responsible for emotional intensity, begins to soften its signals. It doesn't go offline, it just stops flooding your awareness with feelings you can't process. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which usually helps you interpret emotions and connect them to meaning, starts to conserve energy. Its bandwidth narrows, its clarity dims. It handles the bare minimum. You might notice this as a sense of detachment, difficulty caring, or the odd sensation of feeling like you're watching your own life. But the real shift is happening deeper. Your brainstem, the oldest part of your nervous system, has one job: keep you alive at all costs. So, when it senses chronic overload, maybe from stress, grief, heartbreak, loneliness, or a life that demands emotional labor without offering emotional rest, it prioritizes survival over vitality. In that moment, dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation, curiosity, and pleasure, doesn't disappear. That's a misconception. Instead, it gets redistributed. Your brain stops spending dopamine on things that require engagement: joy, creativity, connection, anticipation. Those are luxuries when the system feels threatened. Instead, dopamine shifts toward maintaining physically essential functions: appetite, sleep, basic motor control, minimal emotional awareness, cognitive endurance. The result? You can get through the day, but you can't feel the day. Even small tasks feel heavier, not because you're lazy, but because your reward circuitry is under strict rationing. Think of it like a city during a blackout. Streetlights go off, neighborhoods go dark, but the hospital, the emergency grid, the core infrastructure, those stay powered. Your brain is doing the same thing. It's dimming the unnecessary lights to keep the critical systems alive. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. People assume numbness is a sign that their emotions have vanished permanently. But in reality, your emotional circuits aren't gone. They're hibernating, waiting, resting, repairing themselves behind the scenes. There's another layer most people never hear about: the vagal brake. Your vagus nerve controls the dial between engagement and shutdown. When life feels safe, the vagus supports connection, sensation, presence. But when stress becomes chronic, the brake slams down, not dramatically, just gradually, tightening little by little until you barely feel anything at all. This isn't depression in the clinical sense, though it can overlap. It's not apathy, it's not indifference. It's a biological retreat, a temporary withdrawal of emotional energy to prevent overload. And here's the part neuroscience doesn't always say out loud. This retreat is intelligent, it's adaptive. It's the mind choosing survival over collapse. If you've ever wondered, why am I not feeling anything? The deeper truth might be, your nervous system doesn't feel safe enough to let you feel. Not yet. So, it regulates you the only way it knows how, gently shutting down non-essential emotional functions until the world feels survivable again. And while this shutdown feels empty, frightening, or alien, it holds a quiet promise. Because nothing in the brain shuts down permanently. Neural pathways don't dissolve. The emotional circuits don't die. They wait. They regenerate. They prepare for the moment when they can come back online without overwhelming you. Emotional numbness isn't a failure of your humanity. It's evidence that your system is still fighting for you, even when you can't feel it. It is the body saying, I'm protecting what's left. I'm keeping the core alive. And as clinical as that sounds, it carries something deeply human. Your mind has not given up. It has only stepped back. A breath held, a pause taken. A dimming meant to keep you from burning out completely. There's a moment in every person's emotional life when they realize the numbness isn't just physical, it's psychological, it's existential. It's the strange sensation of being present in your body but absent from your own story. And this is where the misunderstanding cuts the deepest. People assume emotional numbness means they've stopped caring, but the truth is almost always the opposite. You go numb precisely because you cared too much for too long without the resources to sustain it. Emotional shutdown isn't a sign of emotional emptiness. It's a sign of emotional exhaustion. Let me put this gently. Numbness is not the mind's first line of defense. It's the last. It's what happens after months or years of pushing through heartbreak, overwork, silent disappointments, loneliness disguised as independence, and conversations where you swallowed your truth because speaking it felt too risky. Most Americans know this rhythm intimately, even if they don't name it. We live in a culture that rewards high-functioning collapse, where you can be quietly breaking but still praised for being reliable, productive, and strong. And so, the psyche learns to hide its injuries. It learns to hold the weight internally. It learns to survive without being witnessed. Eventually, the emotional system becomes overloaded, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a subtle, gradual thinning. You start feeling stretched, brittle, like someone pulled the strings inside your chest too tight, and now they're fraying at the ends, and the brain responds by dimming your emotional bandwidth. This dimming manifests in ways most people don't recognize as protective. You stop reacting to conflict because your system can't handle more tension. You lose interest in hobbies because your brain has turned off the anticipation switch. You detach from people not because you don't love them, but because connection requires emotional energy you don't have. You appear calm not because you're composed, but because the emotional waves have flattened into a single quiet line. This is the psychology of shutdown. It is the psyche saying, I cannot keep feeling at full volume without breaking. But there's another layer, deeper, more private, rarely spoken about. When numbness arrives, it often brings shame with it. People begin to fear what their numbness says about them. Am I becoming cold? Why can't I feel the way I used to? Is something permanently wrong with me? Why am I drifting from the people I care about? Why do I feel like a ghost in my own home? But emotional numbness is not a moral failure. It isn't evidence that you lack depth or empathy. It's not proof that the best parts of you have withered. In fact, numbness often appears in people who feel too much, not too little. People who absorb emotions deeply, who process the world intensely, who carry the invisible weight of everyone they love. Here's the paradox that psychology doesn't say clearly enough. The people who go numb are often the ones who are overflowing. And when you've spent years being emotionally porous, open, responsive, attuned, the system eventually protects you by creating distance between you and your emotional environment. It's not apathy, it's self-preservation disguised as absence. There's also a cognitive part to this. When you're overwhelmed, your mind begins to narrow your emotional range because a full spectrum of feelings would be too destabilizing. The psyche simplifies your internal world, turning down your emotional volume until everything rests in a flat, manageable quiet. You're not disengaging from life. You're retreating into an inner shelter where you don't have to keep performing emotional strength. But the most important insight is this. You haven't lost your emotions. You've lost access to them. There's a difference. Your emotional world hasn't disappeared. It's gone underground, waiting, recovering, slowly rebuilding its strength in the background while you move through the world with whatever energy remains. This period feels empty, yes. Lonely? Absolutely. But emptiness is not the same as nothingness. It's an in-between state, a psychological corridor you walk through when you're transitioning from emotional depletion to emotional restoration. Most people try to escape this corridor too quickly. They fear the stillness. They panic when joy doesn't come back right away. They ask themselves why they feel hollow instead of asking what their hollow space is trying to tell them. But numbness is not meaningless. It carries information, quiet, subtle, but profoundly important. It tells you you've been living beyond your emotional capacity. It tells you you've been carrying too much. It tells you your mind has reached for the emergency brake. It tells you you've crossed a threshold your nervous system can't sustain. And despite how unsettling it feels, this shutdown is an act of preservation. a psychological reset, a necessary reduction of stimulation, a protective pause in a life that hasn't offered you enough places to rest. Numbness is not abandonment. It's the psyche insisting on a boundary you never learned to give yourself. And inside that boundary, the rebuilding begins. There's a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when your emotional system stops trying to fight and instead folds inward. Most people think emotional shutdown is dramatic, like slamming a door. But for many Americans living high-functioning lives, it happens the way winter arrives in New England, not with a storm, but with a sequence of colder mornings you pretend not to notice. Emotional exhaustion often starts as a mismatch between the weight a person carries and the permission they give themselves to set anything down. You tell yourself it's just a rough week, just a heavy season, just work being work. The same way millions of people convince themselves that a dimmed emotional landscape is still fine enough to keep going. The mind adapts to unbearable pressure by dulling sensation, not because you are weak, but because your psychology is built to preserve the core by shutting the lights in the outer rooms. You don't lose the ability to feel. You lose the safety to feel. One of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional shutdown is this. Your system isn't removing emotions. It's throttling the bandwidth. Like a city preparing for a blackout, it dims everything: joy, excitement, longing, curiosity, because it senses an overload somewhere deeper. What looks like apathy on the outside is usually self-protection on the inside. And sometimes what makes people collapse isn't the presence of pain, but the absence of a witness. In American culture, where self-reliance is treated as a virtue and vulnerability often feels like a liability, many people learn to suffer privately. You become fluent in phrases like, "I'm good," "just tired," "I'll manage," even when your internal world is slowly sinking underwater. Emotional shutdown is often the mind's response to being chronically unseen. Another part of the shutdown is grief, not just grief for a person or a breakup or a moment that ended, but grief for the version of yourself you can't seem to return to. The energetic you, the expressive you, the one who used to look forward to weekends or nights with friends, or even the small rituals that made life feel grounded. Emotional numbness often hides a quieter truth. You're mourning the person you were before survival mode became your default setting. Many people blame themselves for losing motivation, not realizing that the absence of desire is often a sign that the nervous system no longer trusts the world to give back what it invests. So it withholds, it waits, it conserves. The way someone recovering from a deep cut avoids using the injured hand, not because they don't want to, but because the body knows the cost of reopening a wound. In emotional terms, numbness is not the absence of feeling, it's the absence of safety. When you shut down emotionally, your life becomes strangely hollow, like walking through a home you used to love but no longer recognize. The furniture is the same, the walls haven't moved, but something in the atmosphere feels off, like the air has been drained of warmth. This is why people often describe emotional shutdown as feeling like a ghost in my own life. You're present, but not participating. Aware, but not engaged. Awake, but not fully living. One of the most difficult parts is how internal the collapse feels. The world doesn't see trenches. It sees you at work, at the grocery store, replying to emails, nodding politely in conversations. Meanwhile, the emotional weight you carry is invisible, even to people who love you. Emotional numbness is not dramatic enough to alarm anyone, but painful enough to erode you from the inside. You start to detach from joy first, not because joy is too loud, but because joy requires emotional openness, and openness feels unsafe. Then you detach from excitement because excitement requires energy, then connection because connection requires presence. Eventually you detach from yourself because being connected to your own emotions feels overwhelming, confusing, or simply pointless. This is the hidden architecture of emotional shutdown, a gradual narrowing of the emotional aperture until life becomes a grayscale version of itself. You become functional but not nourished, efficient but not alive, present but not truly here. And perhaps the most haunting part, a small, quiet part of you notices. It knows something is wrong. It remembers what you used to feel like. It sends small signals, fatigue that doesn't make sense, frustration that appears out of nowhere, moments where you stare at nothing and feel the weight of everything, but your conscious mind, trained to stay productive, keeps walking. This inner conflict, the one between "I'm not okay" and "I need to keep going," is what makes emotional numbness so painful. It isn't the emptiness itself, but the fact that you're still expected to operate as if nothing has changed. And when you can no longer feel fulfilled, you start to feel defective. But you're not defective, you're overwhelmed. Emotional shutdown is not a flaw in your personality. It's a sign your mind has been carrying more than a human body is designed to hold. It is, in a very real way, a slow form of collapsing while still standing. There's a thought I return to often, especially when I listen to people describe their emotional numbness. Maybe the mind isn't failing. Maybe it's bargaining. Not bargaining with the world, but with you. Trying to negotiate between what you think you should handle and what you can actually survive. Most people assume numbness means the system has collapsed, but sometimes it's the opposite. It means the system has chosen the one strategy with the highest chance of keeping you intact. When you've been running on fear, pressure, or disappointment for too long, the mind chooses silence the way a firefighter chooses oxygen. Not because it feels good, but because it prevents the whole thing from burning down. This is the part of emotional shutdown nobody talks about, the intelligence inside it, the quiet logic underneath the collapse. It's like your system whispers, "If I let you feel everything right now, you will break, so I will hold it for you." That's not failure, that's mercy. One of the insights I've learned, watching people struggle through emotional darkness, Americans who hustle, who survive, who carry stories in their bones, is that numbness often appears when someone has been strong for too long without letting themselves be human for even a moment. And in that deprivation, the mind builds walls, not to keep life out, but to keep you from drowning. The tragedy is that from the outside, those walls look like apathy, coldness, or distance. People misinterpret your silence as indifference when it's actually the last strategy your system has left. This misunderstanding creates a second layer of pain. You start blaming yourself for not feeling. You start believing you're supposed to be different. You compare yourself to the past versions of you who laughed more easily or loved more loudly. But those versions of you didn't carry what you carry now. And here's where the deeper twist emerges. Numbness is not the opposite of feeling. It's the memory of feeling, frozen, preserved, held in suspension. The emotional system never deletes anything. It shelves it, like a museum in the dark. And when life becomes too heavy, the curator inside you switches off the lights, not to erase the exhibits, but to prevent damage. Your joy, your tenderness, your dreams, they're still there, just not accessible under current conditions. This is why people sometimes cry without knowing why, or why a random song on the radio hits harder than it should. Something inside them flickers, a light switch flipping on for a moment. It's not the numbness breaking, it's the archive reminding you it still exists. Another insight that becomes clearer the longer you sit with this phenomenon. Emotional shutdown doesn't happen because you don't care. It happens because you cared for too long without reciprocity, without rest, without repair, without being met halfway by the world or by the people in it. The American lifestyle often reinforces this imbalance. Work first, feel later. If you can't feel, work harder. If you break, break quietly. This pressure creates emotional environments where shutting down feels safer than staying open. But here's the quiet truth. Numbness isn't the enemy. It's a bridge, a place you visit when your emotional system needs time to reset. It becomes dangerous only when you mistake it for home. There's also something deeply human beneath numbness, protest. Not loud protest, not voiced, not articulated, but a small rebellion inside you that says, "No more, not like this." It's your internal boundary, delivered in the only language your exhausted system still has. I've seen many people interpret their emotional shutdown as a sign they're losing themselves. But what if it's the opposite? What if the shutdown is the moment you stop abandoning yourself to meet the expectations of others? What if numbness is your mind's way of dragging you back to yourself by taking everything else offline? One day, often without warning, you notice something small. You taste your coffee again. You laugh at something dumb on TV. You feel moved by the winter light streaming through your window. It's never dramatic. It's always subtle, But it's real. That's the mind turning the lights on in one room, just to check if you're ready. And here's the most important insight. One I return to every time I write or speak about emotional collapse. Numbness isn't the end of your emotional life. It's the request for a new one. A life where you don't push yourself past the edge. A life where you're allowed to feel without bracing for impact. A life where connection doesn't require self-erasure. A life where you stop treating exhaustion as a personality trait. A life where your emotional world isn't something you endure, but something you inhabit. Numbness is the knock on the door. You are the one who eventually opens it. There's a strange moment that happens once you've lived inside numbness long enough. You start to realize the shutdown isn't just emotional, it's architectural. It rearranges how you move through the world. It changes what you notice, what you expect, what you allow yourself to hope for. Most people think numbness is an internal phenomenon, but the more I've watched it unfold in real lives, people across cities like Portland, Chicago, Austin, people who look fine on paper but feel hollow in private, the more I've understood it becomes a worldview, a filter, a language, and it's subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It just shifts the way light lands on your life. There's an American tension woven into all this. The culture rewards productivity, performance, resilience, the constant forward motion. But when you're numb, you stop feeling the forward pull. Days blur, tasks lose their meaning. You become a passenger in your own routine, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you become estranged from yourself. This estrangement becomes the soil where three things grow: detachment, self-erasure, and emotional minimization. Detachment shows up first. It's not dramatic. It's not even sad. It's just this quiet drifting where you watch your life from a half-inch outside your own skin. You show up to work, you joke with friends, you run errands, but none of it lands. You're present in the room, but not present to yourself. Then comes the second layer, self-erasure. This is where you start shrinking your needs because you no longer trust your emotional signals. When everything feels muted, it becomes easier to convince yourself your desires don't matter, or worse, that they're unreasonable. So, you downplay, minimize, soften until your inner world becomes a whisper you train yourself to ignore. And then there's emotional minimization, the belief that your pain isn't real enough to deserve attention. You tell yourself, other people have it worse. I shouldn't be affected by this. It's not a big deal. But numbness doesn't measure pain by size. It measures pain by duration. Long-term quiet suffering carries a different gravity. And this is where the concept begins to expand. Numbness isn't a state, it's a strategy. It's your mind building scaffolding around a part of you that was overwhelmed. But once the scaffolding stays up for too long, you start mistaking it for the building itself. This confusion leads to a painful misunderstanding. The belief that numbness is your personality, that the way you are now is the way you will always be. That this muted internal landscape is your new normal. But no emotional system is static, not even the shutdown ones. You don't need inspiration to wake back up. You don't need a dramatic life event. You don't need someone to swoop in and show you meaning. Most emotional reactivation begins with something far smaller, a flicker of curiosity, a micro moment of noticing, a shift so minimal it would be invisible to anyone but you. Small jolts of aliveness don't mean you're healed. They mean your system is testing the waters. And that brings us to the deeper expansion. Numbness is phase-based. There is the protective phase, where your system shields you, the preservational phase, where it stores what it can't process, and the transitional phase, where it begins to hand pieces back to you, slowly, carefully, almost shyly. People often misread the transitional phase as regression because it comes with uncomfortable sensations, irritability, restlessness, sudden sadness, random frustration. But that's not regression. That's thawing. When ice melts, the first layer is slush, messy, cold, disorganized. Emotional thawing works the same way. It feels chaotic at first because your system is reintroducing sensations you haven't held in a long time. And here's the hidden irony. People who feel numb often assume they're emotionally weak, but the numbness itself proves the opposite. It proves the system had to work overtime to keep you functioning. It proves there is more emotion inside you than you realize. You don't shut down emptiness, you shut down overload. This perspective changes the whole narrative. Instead of asking, "Why can't I feel?" the more truthful question becomes, "What was so heavy that my system had to protect me from it?" That's where the real story begins. Not in the numbness itself, but in what preceded it. Your emotional system is not lost. It's waiting, and everything it has muted, it has saved. All of this is not meant to romanticize numbness or turn it into some mystical spiritual path. It's meant to give you language for what's been happening under the surface, quietly, intelligently, without your permission, but always for your survival. This is the architecture of the shutdown, and knowing the structure is the first step toward ever leaving the building. Recovery from numbness doesn't begin with action. It begins with permission, not permission to be better, or stronger, or more motivated. Permission to simply exist again, without expecting anything from yourself. Most people think healing starts with a plan, but numbness is a different world. And in that world, the smallest shift often carries more weight than the loudest breakthrough. One of the first quiet truths about recovery is this: your emotional system will not wake up all at once. It will return in fragments, tones instead of colors, whispers instead of sentences, flickers instead of flames. And that's enough, because numbness doesn't require you to push your way out. It asks you to stand still long enough for your system to catch up to you. There's a moment I think about often when a person who's been emotionally shut down for months suddenly pauses at something tiny, a pattern of light through the kitchen blinds, the smell of wet pavement after rain, the faint warmth of their coffee mug against their hands. These moments aren't accidents, they're openings. They're the nervous system's way of testing whether the world is safe enough to let you feel again. The problem is, many people miss them. They dismiss these flickers as meaningless because they don't look like the big emotions they're waiting for. But for a system that has been shut down, subtlety is the language of return. This is where the deeper lesson lives. When you're numb, the smallest signals are the signs of life. You don't rebuild emotional capacity through intensity. You rebuild it through awareness, soft, steady noticing. And noticing doesn't require energy. It requires presence, which is the one thing numbness hasn't taken from you. It has only made it harder to trust. Recovery also asks for something else, a willingness to let your emotional world move at its natural speed, even when your mind wants to sprint. People often try to force themselves to feel something. They chase stimulation, intensity, adrenaline, emotional shock, anything to break through the numbness. But this usually backfires, because numbness isn't a wall, it's a threshold. And thresholds don't respond to force. They respond to easing through. If there's one lesson I've learned from watching emotional systems return after long periods of shutdown, it's this: your emotional world comes back when it feels invited, not when it feels demanded. So, recovery begins not with trying to feel more, but by making space to feel less. Less pressure, less expectation, less self-judgment for where you are right now. It begins with simple, quiet questions. What is one small thing I can tolerate today? What sensation feels safe enough to notice? What part of my body feels the least tense? What moment today felt just a little less heavy than the rest? These questions aren't techniques. They're signals to your system that you are willing to meet it where it is, without force, without shame, without demanding instant change. Here's the part most people never hear, the part that actually matters. Feeling does not return because you try harder. Feeling returns because your system finally believes it doesn't have to protect you anymore. And that trust builds slowly, through tiny consistencies, through moments where you choose not to abandon yourself, where you choose not to invalidate your pain, where you choose not to pretend you're fine just because the world expects it. Recovery from numbness isn't about regaining excitement. It's about regaining access to yourself. And sometimes access begins with something as ordinary as sitting on your couch and realizing, for the first time in months, that you're actually here. Not dissociated, not drifting, just present enough to notice a breath you didn't know you were holding. If you take anything from this, let it be this quiet truth. Your emotional system does not need you to be strong. It needs you to be available, even if you don't feel anything yet, even if everything still feels flat. Even if you're terrified, you'll never return to yourself. Availability is not emotional intensity. It's emotional willingness, a soft posture toward your inner world, a small shift from "what's wrong with me" to "what's happening inside me." It is the first quiet step out of numbness, not a sprint, not a leap, just a turning of the head toward the part of you that never stopped waiting. And that turning, subtle, almost invisible, is where recovery begins. Not with answers, but with acknowledgement, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with fixing yourself, but with finally, gently meeting yourself. There's a moment, usually late at night, when the noise of the day finally settles and the world feels strangely far away. It's in that quiet that people who've lived inside numbness often meet themselves again. Not dramatically, not with clarity, but with a kind of hesitant recognition, like seeing your reflection in a window at dusk. Faint, blurred, but still unmistakably you. If you're here, listening, there's a good chance you've spent a long time feeling disconnected from yourself. Maybe it happens slowly, the way winter creeps in, one unnoticed degree at a time, or maybe it happens suddenly, a collapse you didn't see coming. Either way, numbness has a way of making you believe you're gone, that something essential inside you has evaporated, leaving only the outline. But outlines are not emptiness. They're the beginning of form. There's something quietly profound in realizing you're not broken. You're paused, held, suspended between what hurt you and what you haven't yet had the strength to face. And maybe that suspension has felt like failure. Maybe it's felt like the absence of life. But stillness is not absence. Stillness is space. And space is where things grow when they are ready. I'm not here to tell you that everything will get better. I don't believe in tying bows on experiences that demand more honesty than comfort. But I am here to remind you that numbness does not erase the deeper parts of you. It only lowers the volume. Your emotional world hasn't disappeared. It's waiting beneath the surface, like the earth in February, looking dead, but simply gathering itself. The return to feeling doesn't look like sunrise. It looks like a faint shift in temperature, barely noticeable unless you're paying attention. One of the things I've learned, watching people fight silently with their inner world, is that humans don't break evenly. We fracture in the places we cared the most, and those same places are where the thaw begins. Your numbness didn't form out of emptiness, it formed out of impact. Impact leaves shape. Shape leaves memory, and memory leaves a way back. You might not know it, but every time you paused at something small, soft light across the floor, a passing laugh from someone on the street, the weight of your own breath, you were already beginning your return. These aren't random moments. They're the first hints that your system is reconsidering its shutdown. They're signs of life redistributing itself in you. Maybe you've felt those flickers but dismissed them. That's okay. They weren't asking to be understood. They were asking to be noticed. If your emotional world feels muted now, it doesn't mean it has abandoned you. It means it's asking for a gentler pace, a pace that fits your capacity, not your expectations, a pace that reflects who you are now, not who you were before everything grew heavy. There's a kind of courage in acknowledging that numbness has been part of your landscape. The world rarely gives people permission to say, "I don't feel connected to anything right now." But saying it, even quietly, is a form of honesty that opens the door a little wider. And maybe that's all recovery needs at first. A door that isn't locked. You don't need to rush through it. You don't need to know what's on the other side. You don't need to manufacture hope. You just need to trust that you haven't seen everything your emotional life has to offer. Not yet. There is more inside you than what numbness allowed you to access. More color, more depth, more complexity. Not dramatic, cinematic joy. Not a sudden return to who you were years ago, but a slow re-entry into yourself. One that doesn't require pretending, performing, or forcing anything into place. If you've spent months or years feeling detached, here's the truth I want to leave you with. Numbness is not the end of your story. It's the quiet chapter before the next opening. And just because the opening hasn't arrived yet doesn't mean it won't. Sometimes the system waits until you're no longer trying to earn your right to feel. You don't have to be ready for anything. You don't have to want anything. You just have to stay here long enough to notice when the ground shifts again. And when it does, when something small inside you stirs, even briefly, try not to dismiss it. Don't rush it. Don't demand meaning from it. Just recognize it for what it is, a sign that you are still reachable, a sign that your inner world is not gone, a sign that somewhere beneath the muted surface, you are already beginning to return to yourself. In the end, recovery from numbness is not a destination, it's a direction. And the fact that you're aware of the silence inside you means you're already facing the right way.